Hello again. This is Rick Lacey, former BP senior financial analyst, self-proclaimed BP giant killer, and author of the BP Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine and a 424-page political thriller by the same name. Today I'm going to provide a refresher course on the Monroe Doctrine and explain why the BP Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is the only thing BP fears and may be the only avenue to justice for our long-suffering Gulf Coast and the thousands of American citizens already dead or dying as a direct result of exposure to BP's toxic Corexit. You heard me right. American citizens are suffering and dying, and it's being covered up. Well, cover-ups never work, and I've made it my mission to expose the truth and make BP pay. To understand exactly what BP did and why they did it, watch my previous video, the BP Corexit cover-up and the $4,300 per barrel motive. And don't forget to tell your friends. We can't let BP get away with it. Okay, back to the Monroe Doctrine. I'm calling today's video the BP Giant Killer, Rick Lacey and the BP Corollary. Here we go. Systematically and over many years, BP has ingrained its control over those elected officials who control agencies charged with regulating and controlling BP. In effect, BP regulates itself. The spill was a direct result of BP granting itself exemptions to regulations under which all other deepwater drillers operate. BP used this same method of control to exempt itself from Coast Guard, EPA, and NOAA regulations during the cleanup. That's how BP was able to obtain exemptions to pump and spray toxic chemicals to disperse and hide the oil rather than clean it up. BP granted itself exemptions that resulted in the gassing of 170,000 American citizens and the poisoning of the Gulf of Mexico. If another nation had done this, we'd be at war. If another nation at war would have done it, it would have been a war crime. During the spill, and continuing to this day, BP has used its influence over the media to stifle reporting while it relentlessly perpetuated its lies, spending hundreds of millions of dollars on a public relations campaign. Tell a lie often enough on primetime TV, and most Americans will believe it. That strategy has been so successful that most Americans who have not read the BP Corollary, and that's nearly all of you, have a favorable impression of the company responsible for the worst environmental disaster in history and a growing health crisis along our Gulf Coast. During the spill, and continuing to this day, BP has influenced the scientific and academic communities through multi-million-dollar grants and donations to those institutions and by contracting directly with our scientists and academics. I know it's hard to accept that all those marine biologists you thought were in those professions because of their love for the sea would sell out for BP dollars, but those are the facts. It was hard for me to accept as well. The few unbiased studies that have been done are suppressed by the controlled media. The net result of all this is that BP enjoys favorable public image and is effectively above all U.S. law, except one. There remains only one thing BP fears: yours truly and the BP Corollary. To better understand our only remaining weapon against BP, let's review the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine has long established the United States as the protector of the hemisphere with the right to guard against the undue influence of foreign powers and to expel such powers when it is determined that their intent here is counter to the best interests of Americans. The doctrine was not an act of Congress and is not a treaty. It has not been ratified. It was not even put to writing. It was enunciated by President Monroe in a speech in 1823 after much consulting with Thomas Jefferson and John Quincy Adams. Various presidents, for various reasons, have invoked and expanded the doctrine to justify actions to resolve various threats and developments not envisioned by Monroe. Not that Monroe. President Roosevelt said, "As the policy of the United States in the Monroe Doctrine was distinctively the policy of the United States, the government of the United States has reserved to itself its definition and application." Even the Treaty of Versailles declared the Monroe Doctrine wholly outside the jurisdiction of the League of Nations and reserved to the United States the sole right to interpret the doctrine. The Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine in 1904 asserted the right of the United States to intervene in Latin America in cases of flagrant and chronic wrongdoing. The Clark Memorandum of 1928 further expanded the implied powers of the doctrine by concluding that the United States had a self-evident right of self-defense and that was all that was needed to justify certain actions. In keeping with the spirit of the doctrine, it did not define or limit certain actions. President Wilson observed, "The Monroe Doctrine was proclaimed by the United States on her own authority. It has always been maintained and always will be maintained upon her own responsibility." The doctrine has never been limited in application to sovereign nations. President Taft added the principle of dollar diplomacy, under which the United States intervened militarily in some Caribbean countries to protect the investments of United States corporations. Clearly, the investments of United States corporations in the Gulf of Mexico have been adversely affected by the actions of BP. Because BP could not drill safely, all drilling was suspended, and thousands of other businesses suffered the consequences of the spill. Another extension of the Monroe Doctrine came in the form of the Henry Cabot Lodge Corollary, which states in part, "When any harbor or other place in the American continents is so situated that the occupation thereof for naval or military purposes might threaten the safety of the United States, the government of the United States could not see without grave concern the possession of such harbor or other place by any corporation or association which has a relationship to another government not American, as to give that government practical power of control for national purposes." Note that the United States maintains the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in caverns under Louisiana in very close proximity to the BP investments in the Gulf. Restricting operations in the waters surrounding the Strategic Reserve to American companies serves the national interest and is consistent with the doctrine. We already require American oil coming out of the wells in the Gulf to be transported by American vessels. It would not be a big leap to restrict its extraction to responsible American oil companies. Certainly no American oil company would have released oil-eating microbes into the waters over the cavern that contain the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Let me give you a little aside right here about BP's attitude towards U.S. law. The law I just referred to that requires U.S. crude oil to be shipped in U.S. vessels is the Jones Act. When I was at BP, I worked for a while in the Alaskan operations under Lord Brown. Since BP is a foreign corporation, it couldn't use its own ships to transport its Alaskan crude oil from the terminal at Valdez to its West Coast refineries. So what do you think BP did? It created an American shell corporation, sold the British tankers to the Shell Corporation, put American flags on them, and leased them back. That way the oil was technically shipped in American vessels. Within the company, we actually called the ships EOVs, short for effectively owned vessels. U.S. laws are not something BP obeys. They're an obstacle BP finds a way around. Okay, back to the doctrine. President Kennedy relied on Monroe, not that Monroe. President Kennedy relied on Monroe to blockade Cuba, turn back the Soviet vessels, and evict the Russians. Neither Russia nor Cuba had actually done anything. There was no flagrant and chronic wrongdoing, and there was certainly nothing in the original 1823 enunciation concerning missile placements. The Kennedy actions were taken in anticipation of wrongdoing. In other words, the Monroe Doctrine means whatever the President of the United States declares it to mean and can be extended by the President at his sole discretion, without explanation and not subject to review by any government, corporation, court, or international body. Our President need only cite the doctrine, and he has the power to force BP to divest its American assets, make restitution, and leave our hemisphere. There's little doubt that the majority of the electorate would support expansion of the doctrine and the use of its powers to the resolution of the BP issue, were the facts surrounding the spill and the conduct of BP widely known. Understanding that the Monroe Doctrine applies, that congressional action is not necessary, and that the President must answer to the will of the people and acquiesce to our demands, we must make those demands understood. In 2015, the United States finds within the Americas a foreign corporation with no respect for U.S. law engaged in flagrant and chronic wrongdoing which has caused and is causing the deaths of innocent Americans the destruction of the economic livelihoods of Americans, the pollution of America's vital natural resources, and the extraction of profits earned on American mineral wealth. In order for the United States to properly and righteously defend itself, we must expand the Monroe Doctrine to include foreign corporations, in addition to foreign governments. Toward that end, the BP Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is proposed as follows. The BP Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Whenever a foreign corporation with investments and operations in the Americas engages in flagrant and chronic wrongdoing, whether through overt act or negligence and irresponsibility, to the actual or anticipated detriment of America, its people, or its resources, the United States reserves the right to force said corporation to divest its American assets, make restitution for financial harms to America or Americans, and to leave the hemisphere of the Americas. Understanding the above, it gets real simple. Neither Congress nor any federal agency will act against BP. Only one man has the power to adopt the BP Corollary and make BP pay. That man is our president, and he answers to us. If, and only if, we the people demand it, our president will issue the executive order that ends BP in America and brings justice to our Gulf Coast. If not him, who? If not now, when?